In the summer of 1822, as yellow fever tore through the river town of Natchez, Mississippi with near-biblical violence, an enslaved man named Jonas Ryder stepped into the chambers of the city's medical board with blood on his hands and hope in his voice. Jonas, owned by the Fairmont plantation, carried a treatment that had already spared dozens of lives among the enslaved quarters of men and women who should have been dead, but weren't. The doctors scarcely looked at him. Clad in starched coats and fortified by diplomas from elite Eastern institutions, they dismissed Jonas as quickly as one might brush away dust. To them, he was an illiterate field hand peddling superstition, not a bearer of life-saving knowledge. They returned to their trusted methods of bloodletting, mercury, and prayer, confident in tradition and blind to evidence. What they refused to see was the origin of Jonas's cure. It was knowledge carried across oceans and chains, passed down in whispered breaths by a woman who had survived 3 yellow fever outbreaks in Sandom before being sold into Mississippi. Her survival was not luck, it was memory, experience, and science that history refused to name. As the death toll surged past 100 in just 2 weeks, entire families vanished from the grand homes along Silver Street. Curtains were drawn, doors were nailed shut, coffins multiplied faster than cures, and Jonas stood at a crossroads no human being should ever face. Remain silent and watch hundreds more die while waiting for permission that would never come, here or act, knowing full well that an enslaved person practicing medicine faced execution. This is a story about knowledge turned into a crime, about arrogance that spread as fast as disease, about how pride, not fever, became the deadliest contagion of all, and about a man with nothing to protect but his conscience, who became the last barrier between a city and total ruin. Natchez glittered above the Mississippi River like a jewel set into the bluffs, gazing down at the muddy currents that carried cotton, commerce, and in the summer of 1822, death itself. By then, the city had become one of the wealthiest in the American South, its fortune extracted from enslaved bodies and the relentless flow of white gold through its port. Natchez was a city sharply divided, as unmistakably as the line between river and sky. Natchez on the hill, where the plantation owners lived in columned mansions with French wallpaper and crystal chandeliers, and Natchez under the hill, the lawless waterfront district where riverboat workers, gamblers, and traders crowded into ramshackle taverns that never closed. Jonas Ryder had lived his entire 34 years in bondage, first in Louisiana, then at the Fairmont plantation 10 miles north of Natchez proper. He'd been purchased at age 8 alongside his mother, separated from his father in New Orleans, at an auction he could still see when he closed his eyes. The Fairmonts were considered, by the standards of the time and place, reasonable owners, which meant the whippings were infrequent, the rations barely adequate, and the work relentless, but not quite fatal. Jonas worked the cotton fields from conceit to can't see. His hands permanently stained from the bowls, his back marked with scars that had faded to white lines against his dark skin. What set Jonas apart from the other 130 enslaved people at Fairmont wasn't physical strength or submission. It was his mind. He absorbed information like the earth absorbed rain. Remembering every conversation he overheard, every treatment he witnessed, every plant and root the older enslaved people used for remedies. He couldn't read or write. Teaching the enslaved to read was illegal in Mississippi, punishable by 39 lashes. But his memory was flawless. He could recall the exact mixture of herbs an elderly woman named Lucinda had used to stop infection in a child's wound 3 years prior. He remembered how Thomas, a man who'd been brought from Jamaica, described which leaves to chew for stomach pain. Jonas collected this knowledge the way some men collected coins, storing it away for when it might mean the difference between life and death. In March of 1821, the Fairmonts acquired a new enslaved woman from the estate sale in Louisiana. Her name was Margot, though she'd been called many names before that in a life that had carried her from West Africa to Santa, from the chaos of the Haitian Revolution to Louisiana, and finally to Mississippi. She was probably 50 years old, maybe older, with silver hair she kept wrapped in an indigo cloth and eyes that had witnessed empires fall. Margot barely spoke English, and when she did, her words carried the musical lilt of French Creole. The other enslaved people at Fairmont gave her a wide berth. At first, she was strange, foreign, moved differently, spoke differently, looked at you like she could see things you'd rather keep hidden. But Jonas saw something else in Margot. Knowledge. She knew plants in a way that went beyond simple remedies. She could look at a person and know what was wrong inside them before they spoke a word. She kept a small leather pouch under her clothing that contained dried leaves, seeds, bark fragments, materials Jonas didn't recognize. He began to seek her out in the evenings after the work was done, sitting near her cabin and asking careful questions. At first, she ignored him. Then slowly she began to answer. Margot told him about Sandang, about the yellow fever that came in waves during the wet season, turning whole plantations into graveyards. She described how the fever started. The sudden chills, the back pain, the eyes turning the color of old ivory, then the terrible black vomit that meant death was coming. The doctors, she said in her broken English, mixing French words with the explanation, they bleed people. They give mercury. They kill more than the fever kill. She spat after saying this, a gesture of disgust that needed no translation. She taught Jonas about cinchona bark, though she called it by a different name, quinina, and how it had to be prepared in a specific way, boiled at a specific temperature given in specific doses. She showed him a bitterroot that reduced fever, leaves that settled the vomiting, preparations that kept the blood from becoming too thin. Most importantly, she taught him about mosquito control. Though she didn't use those words, didn't know the science behind it. She simply said, the sickness come from bad air near water when it's hot. Where mosquitoes thick, sickness thick. You keep mosquitoes away. You keep some sickness away. Jonas listened to everything, remembered everything, understood that he was being given something precious, the power to save lives. But he also understood the danger. Enslaved people who practiced medicine without approval, who were seen as possessing power or knowledge that threatened the established order, often disappeared. They were sold south to the brutal sugar plantations where survival was measured in months, not years. Or they simply vanished one night, a lesson to others who might think they were more than property. Margot survived only 7 months after arriving at Fairmont. In October 1821, she collapsed in the fields and within 2 days, she was dead. The plantation doctor said it was exhaustion and age. Jonas, washing her body for burial as was the custom, saw the yellowing of her eyes, the fever-wasted frame, and suspected she'd fought yellow fever before, and finally lost. But before she died, Margot had pressed her leather pouch into Jonas's hands and whispered something in French he didn't fully understand, but felt in his bones. Sauvio, save them. The fever arrived in Natchez on June 14, 1822. It came up the river on a steamboat called the Providence, which docked at Natchez under the hill after a slow journey from New Orleans. The boat's manifest listed cotton, barrels of whiskey, farm equipment, and 23 passengers. What it didn't list was the cargo of death breeding in the water barrels and the shadows of the hold, Eds, Egypt mosquitoes, carriers of yellow fever, waiting for warm blood and new territory. The first victim was an Irish dockworker named Patrick Hannigan, who unloaded the Providence's cargo in the brutal midday heat. He felt fine that afternoon, stopped at a tavern under the hill at evening, drank whiskey, and played cards. By the next morning, he was shivering so violently his bunkmates could hear his teeth chattering through the thin walls. The fever climbed to heights that made him delirious. He vomited, complained of back pain so severe he couldn't stand, and within 72 hours of the first symptom, Patrick Hannigan was dead. The doctor who examined the body, a young physician named Dr. Raymond Fletcher, noted the symptoms: high fever, back pain, jaundice, and knew immediately what he was looking at. Yellow fever, the terror of every southern port city, the scourge that could wipe out a quarter of a population in a single summer. He reported his findings to the mayor and the medical board, a group of 6 physicians who oversaw public health in Natchez and the surrounding county. The medical board, led by Dr. Cornelius Howell, a 60-year-old graduate of the University of Pennsylvania who'd practiced in Natchez for 30 years, convened an emergency meeting on June 17. Their approach to yellow fever was based on what they'd learned in medical school on the established wisdom of the day. The fever was caused by miasma, bad air rising from rotting organic matter, from the filth of the river district, from the moral decay of places like Natchez under the hill. The treatment was aggressive: bloodletting to remove poisoned blood, mercury compounds to purge the system, cold baths to bring down fever, isolation of the sick to prevent the spread of corrupted air. Notices were posted throughout Natchez. Citizens were advised to avoid the waterfront, to burn tar and sulfur to purify the air, to seek immediate medical attention if fever developed. The city's physicians prepared air instruments, lancets for bloodletting, porcelain bowls to catch the blood, bottles of calomel, mercurous chloride for purging, laudanum for pain. They were trained, educated, confident. They were also, though they didn't know it, about to make everything worse. By June 20, there were 14 confirmed cases in Natchez under the hill. By June 23, 37 cases with 9 dead. The fever wasn't respecting the invisible line between the riverfront and the bluffs. It climbed the hills into the wealthy district, appearing first in the home of Judge Samuel Fairfax, whose daughter Elaine came down with the characteristic symptoms after visiting a dressmaker under the hill. Elaine Fairfax was 19 years old, engaged to be married, planning a wedding for September. She died on June 25. And her death sent shockwaves through Natchez on the hill. If the fever could kill a judge's daughter, it could kill anyone. The body count accelerated with horrifying speed. The cemetery couldn't keep pace with the burials. Coffin makers worked around the clock. The churches held constant funeral services until the priests themselves began falling ill. The river, normally alive with commercial traffic, saw boat after boat bypass Natchez entirely. Word had spread that the city was plague-stricken, and no captain wanted to risk crew or cargo by docking there. The physicians worked themselves to exhaustion, moving from house to house, applying their treatments with dedication and increasing desperation. Dark Howell performed bloodletting on 40 patients in a single day, returning home with his coat stained dark. Dr. Fletcher administered mercury treatments until his hands trembled from fatigue, but the death rate didn't slow. If anything, it accelerated. Patients who survived the fever often died from the treatments, from blood loss, from mercury poisoning, from systems too weakened to endure aggressive interventions. No one questioned the methods. The methods were science. The methods were what every medical school taught, what every textbook confirmed, what centuries of tradition supported. Meanwhile, 10 miles north at the Fairmont plantation, Jonas Ryder watched the fear spread among the enslaved community like ripples in water. News traveled fast through the network of enslaved people who moved between plantations and town, carrying messages, trading information, warning each other of dangers. They heard about the fever in Natchez, about the death toll, about the doctors who couldn't stop it. On June 27, the fever arrived at Fairmont. A field hand named Samuel collapsed during the afternoon work, fever-stricken and shaking. By evening, 2 more were sick. The overseer, Mr. Talbot, reported it to James Fairmont, who immediately sent for his plantation physician, an elderly doctor named Drive Graham, who made rounds to several plantations in the area. Dr. Graham arrived the next morning, examined the sick, confirmed yellow fever, and prescribed the standard treatments: bloodletting, purging, isolation. Jonas, helping to carry one of the sick men to the isolation cabin, watched Dr. Graham work. He saw the lancet cut into fevered flesh, watched the blood drain into bowls, saw mercury compounds forced down throats. He said nothing. Speaking out would be suicide. But that night, after Dr. Graham left, Jonas made a decision that would change everything. He went to his cabin and retrieved Margot's leather pouch hidden beneath the floorboards under his sleeping pallet. Inside were the materials she'd given him: cinchona bark carefully dried and wrapped, seeds from a plant she'd called strong leaf, dried roots whose purposes he'd memorized. He also carried knowledge, exact preparations, specific temperatures, Crucial timing. He had watched 3 people die from yellow fever at Fairmont the previous summer, and he'd watched Dr. Graham apply the same treatments that were now filling Natchez' cemetery. Jonas understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with formal education that the accepted treatment was killing people faster than the disease. The question was, what was he willing to risk to prove it? Jonas had seen death before. Not just death from disease, but death from defiance. When he was 16, another enslaved man at Fairmont, a field hand named Nathan, had dared to speak up during a punishment he believed was unjust. The overseer had been about to whip a young boy for allegedly stealing food. And Nathan, unable to stay silent, had stepped forward and said the boy was innocent, that Nathan had seen someone else take the food. The overseer, enraged at being contradicted by enslaved property, had turned the whip on Nathan instead. But Nathan didn't submit. He grabbed the whip mid-strike, an act so shocking that everything stopped. For exactly 3 seconds, Nathan held the whip, staring at the overseer with something like triumph in his eyes. He was sold within 24 hours, sent to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. Word came back 6 months later that Nathan was dead, worked to death in the cane fields where enslaved people lasted an average of 7 years. The lesson was clear. Any assertion of power, any challenge to authority, any suggestion that an enslaved person might know something a white person didn't was punishable by torture or death. Yet Jonas also remembered other lessons passed down through whispered stories in the quarters on long summer nights. Stories of enslaved people who'd saved lives with herbal knowledge, who delivered babies when white doctors refused to come, who treated infections and fevers and kept children alive through winters that should have killed them. This knowledge existed in the shadows, practiced quietly, never acknowledged by the people who benefited from it. The white doctors might ignore it, might deny its existence, but it was real. Jonas had seen it work. He thought about Margot, about everything she'd survived. The Middle Passage, slavery in Sandang, the violent revolution that had torn that island apart, the fever outbreaks that killed thousands. She'd survived because she knew things the doctors didn't. And she'd given that knowledge to Jonas, knowing he might be the only person who'd use it, who'd remember it, who'd risk everything to prove its value. On the night of June 28, after Dr. Graham had left and the sick had been isolated in a cabin at the edge of the quarters, Jonas made his move. He prepared the cinchona bark exactly as Margot had taught him, boiled in water at a specific temperature. Not too hot, which would destroy the beneficial properties, not too cool, which wouldn't extract them. He added the root that reduced fever mixed in a preparation from the strong leaf seeds that helped with the vomiting. He made enough for the 3 sick men in the isolation cabin. He approached the cabin near midnight when the overseer was drunk and asleep when the plantation had settled into its uneasy nighttime quiet. The sick men were in bad condition, high fevers, jaundiced skin, the beginning stages of the black vomit that signaled the final phase. Jonas spooned the bitter liquid into their mouths, explaining nothing because there wasn't time, forcing them to swallow despite their weakened state. He stayed with them through the night, monitoring their temperatures, giving additional doses when needed, cleaning them when the vomiting came. By dawn, 2 of the 3 men showed improvement. Their fevers had dropped slightly. The delirium had eased. The 3rd man, who'd been furthest along in the disease progression, died just after sunrise. But Jonas suspected he'd been too far gone by the time treatment started. Still, a 2/3 survival rate was infinitely better than what Dr. Graham's methods had achieved. Over the next 3 days, Jonas quietly treated 12 more cases at Fairmont. He had to be careful, had to move in the shadows, had to make it appear that he was simply helping tend the sick, while Dr. Graham's treatments did the real work. But the results spoke for themselves. Of the 15 people Jonas treated, 11 survived. Of the 8 people who received only Dr. Graham's bloodletting and mercury, 2 survived, and both were young, strong field hands whose bodies could withstand the aggressive interventions. People in the quarters began to notice. They didn't speak openly about it, but Jonas saw it in their eyes, felt it in the way they looked at him when he passed. They knew, and more importantly, they trusted him. On July 3, James Fairmont himself commented to his overseer that the fever seemed to be burning itself out at the plantation, that they'd been fortunate to lose only 4 people when neighboring plantations were reporting devastation. The overseer agreed, attributing their good fortune to Dr. Graham's excellent care and perhaps divine intervention. Jonas, standing nearby with a water bucket, said nothing. In Natchez, the situation spiraled into nightmare. By early July, the death toll had passed 150. The city was paralyzed by fear and grief. Families who could afford it fled to relatives in inland areas, abandoning their homes, leaving servants and enslaved people to fend for themselves. Those who remained locked themselves inside, burning sulfur and tar, hanging bags of camphor around their necks, praying for salvation. The streets in Natchez on the hill, usually alive with social calls and commercial activity, were empty, except for the death carts that made their grim rounds each morning. Natchez under the hill was worse. The fever tore through the crowded waterfront district like fire through dry grass, killing dock workers, prostitutes, tavern owners, gamblers, boat crews. Bodies were stacked like cordwood outside the makeshift hospital set up in a riverside warehouse. The stench of death mixed with the perpetual smell of river mud and human waste. Rats moved freely among the dying and mosquitoes, though no one yet understood their role, bred in the standing water that collected in every corner. The medical board met daily, increasingly desperate, increasingly at odds with each other over proper treatment protocols. Dr. Howell insisted on aggressive bloodletting. Dr. Fletcher argued for higher doses of colum. A younger physician, Dr. Martin Chambers, suggested that perhaps the treatments themselves were weakening patients, but he was shouted down by his seniors. The suggestion that educated physicians might be doing harm was absurd, offensive, dangerous to public confidence. On July 8, something shifted. An enslaved man named Isaiah, who worked for the Pritchard family in Natchez on the hill, became severely ill with yellow fever. The Pritchards had already lost their teenage son to the fever 3 days prior, and Mrs. Pritchard was beside herself, unable to bear losing anyone else in her household. But Isaiah was valuable property, a skilled carpenter and handyman who'd been with the family for 12 years. And Mr. Pritchard wanted him treated with the same aggressive medical care they'd given their son. Dr. Fletcher was called. He performed bloodletting, administered colum, prescribed cold baths in isolation. Over the next 24 hours, Isaiah's condition deteriorated rapidly. By July 9, the black vomit had started, and Dr. Fletcher privately informed Mr. Pritchard that survival was unlikely. That evening, one of the other enslaved people in the Pritchard household, a woman named Ruth, who did laundry and cooking, made a desperate decision. She knew Jonas. They were from the same region in Louisiana originally, had maintained contact through the networks that connected enslaved people across plantations and town. Ruth had heard through those whispered channels about what had happened at Fairmont, about Jonas's treatments, about the survival rates that seemed impossible. After dark, Ruth walked the 10 miles from Natchez to the Fairmont plantation. It was dangerous. Enslaved people couldn't travel without passes, and being caught meant punishment. But she'd made the calculation that Isaiah's life was worth the risk. She found Jonas in the quarters and begged him to come back to Natchez to treat Isaiah before it was too late. Jonas understood immediately what she was asking him to do. Leaving the plantation without permission was illegal. Treating someone without his owner's approval was illegal. Contradicting a white doctor's treatment was potentially fatal. But Ruth was on her knees, tears streaming down her face. And Jonas knew that if he had this knowledge and didn't use it, every death that followed was a weight he'd carry forever. He told Ruth to return to Natchez to tell Isaiah's family he'd be there the following night. Then Jonas went to his cabin and began preparing the medicines he'd need, crushing bark and roots, mixing preparations, filling small bottles that he could carry hidden in his clothing. He knew there was no going back from this decision. He was crossing a line that would change everything. On the night of July 10th, Jonas left Fairmont and walked through the darkness to Natchez. He moved through the forest paralleling the main road, avoiding patrols. Arriving at the Pritchard house near midnight, Ruth let him in through the back entrance, and he was taken to the small room where Isaiah lay dying. The smell hit him first, the characteristic stench of black vomit, of internal bleeding, of a body destroying itself. Isaiah was barely conscious, his skin the color of old parchment, his eyes sunken and yellowed. Jonas had seen patients this far gone before. Margot had told him the truth. Once the black vomit started, once the disease reached its final stage, even the best treatment only worked perhaps one time in 4. But 1 in 4 was better than none. Jonas worked quickly, spooning his preparations into Isaiah's mouth, managing to get him to swallow. Through sheer persistence, he explained to Ruth exactly how to continue the treatment, the doses, the timing, the importance of keeping Isaiah hydrated without forcing too much liquid at once. He told her what signs to watch for, what would indicate improvement or deterioration. Then before dawn could catch him in the city, Jonas slipped back into the darkness and walked the 10 miles back to Fairmont, arriving just before the morning work bell rang. For the next 2 days, Jonas went about his regular work, acting as if nothing had happened, while every free moment his mind was in Natchez, wondering if Isaiah would survive, wondering if he just wasted medicine on a man too far gone to save, wondering if someone had noticed his absence and a punishment was coming. On the evening of July 12th, Ruth appeared again at Fairmont. Jonas saw her coming up the path to the quarters and felt his stomach drop. Surely she'd only come back if Isaiah had died, if the family was angry, if there was trouble. But when Ruth reached him, she was smiling, crying, holding his hands. Isaiah was alive, not just alive, but improving. The fever had broken, the black vomit had stopped. He was weak, but he was conscious, aware, asking for food. Ruth said that Mrs. Pritchard, who'd witnessed the recovery, had asked where the medicine came from, who had treated him. Ruth had lied, said Isaiah must have had a stronger constitution than the doctors thought, that God had intervened. But Mrs. Pritchard wasn't stupid. She knew something had changed. Some treatment had been applied. That wasn't what Dr. Fletcher ordered. She wants to see you, Ruth said. Mrs. Pritchard, she says, if you can save Isaiah, maybe you can save others. Jonas felt something cold settle in his chest. This was the moment where everything became public, where he stepped out of the shadows and into a light that could burn him alive. But Ruth was right. If he could save Isaiah, he could save others. Hundreds of others, given what was happening in Natchez. Tell Mrs. Pritchard, Jonas said slowly, that I'll come. But she needs to understand. If the doctors find out, if they know I'm contradicting their treatments, they'll stop me. They'll arrest me or worse. She has to decide if she's willing to protect me. Ruth nodded and left. 2 days later, she returned with a message. Mrs. Pritchard wanted Jonas to come to Natchez. She would personally guarantee his safety. She wanted him to treat her household, her neighbors, anyone who was sick. She'd seen a miracle, and she wasn't going to let medical pride or racial prejudice prevent more miracles. On July 15th, Jonas Ryder walked into Natchez and began openly treating yellow fever patients with methods no educated doctor in the city accepted as legitimate. He had no idea he was about to save nearly 300 lives, or that doing so would make him powerful enemies among the very men who were supposed to be saving people themselves. Mrs. Pritchard was a woman of considerable social standing. Her husband Charles Pritchard owned extensive cotton holdings and served on the city council. And when she threw open her home to an enslaved healer against all social convention, Natchez paid attention. At first, it was simple curiosity. Word spread through the networks of servants and enslaved people. Jonas Ryder from the Fairmont plantation was in the city. He was treating fever patients, and people were surviving at rates the white doctors couldn't match. The first few patients Jonas treated beyond Isaiah were household servants in wealthy homes. People whose owners were desperate enough to try anything, whose deaths wouldn't spark outrage, but whose survival might offer hope. Jonas worked methodically, explaining nothing to the white families, but teaching the enslaved caregivers exactly how to prepare and administer the treatments. He knew his best chance of success was to create a network of people who could continue the work, even if he was stopped. A lairess named Dinah learned to prepare the cinchona bark preparation. A coachman named Benjamin learned to identify the right plants for the fever-reducing root. An elderly house servant named Clara learned the timing of doses, the signs that indicated improvement, the ways to keep mosquitoes away from the sick. Not because anyone understood why, but because Jonas insisted it mattered. He made them memorize everything, repeat it back to him, practice until they could do it in their sleep. The results were undeniable. Of the first 20 patients Jonas treated directly or through his trained helpers, 16 survived. Compared to the mortality rate under the city doctor's care, which hovered around 70%, Jonas's success rate was miraculous. Families began requesting him, specifically sending servants to find him, offering payment to James Fairmont if he'd allow Jonas to continue working in the city. Fairmont, recognizing a financial opportunity, agreed for $5 per patient, an enormous sum for the time Jonas could treat fever victims in Natchez, with the money going directly to Fairmont. It was a devil's bargain that made Jonas profitable property, but it also gave him official permission to move freely in the city, at least within the constrained bounds of treating fever patients. He couldn't legally practice medicine. That remained a crime for an enslaved person. But in the chaos of an epidemic, legal necessities gave way to desperate pragmatism. By late July, Jonas was treating between 10 and 15 new patients per day. He moved through Natchez like a shadow, arriving at houses before dawn, leaving after dark, always accompanied by Ruth or another enslaved person who could verify his presence was authorized. He barely slept, ate only what people pressed into his hands, worked until his body trembled with exhaustion. But the death rate was dropping. Natchez noticed. This is when the medical board noticed, too. Dr. Cornelius Howell first heard about Jonas on July 23 when he arrived at the Montgomery household to treat Mrs. Montgomery's yellow fever and found an enslaved man